Is the Face the Nation roundtable. To be honest with you, it was pretty mundane, but for those of you who can't get it or didn't get it, I'm going to put it up.
Joining us now for political analysis, Susan Page is USA Today's Washington bureau chief. Jamel Bowie is chief political correspondent for Slate magazine, and he's the CBS News political analyst. Molly Ball covers politics for The Atlantic, and Ramesh Ponnuru is a senior editor at the National Review and a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Ramesh, I want to start with you. At the end of the week, Donald Trump has been to Mexico, met with the Mexican president. He also gave a zesty speech in Arizona in the same day. Do the calculation. Where do things stand at the end of the week with Donald Trump and immigration?
Well, I think that it is a confusing story. Today on the airwaves, Trump supporters Chris Christie on this show and Rudy Giuliani are saying he has softened on immigration, he's no longer for mass deportation, and this story is not getting through. Well, one of the reasons it's not getting through is that Trump didn't actually say that mass deportation's not on the table anymore. He simply implied it. And he did it in a speech that was all of the atmospherics of it were extremely hard line. It's a speech that actually reads differently than it looks. And I don't see how the Trump campaign expects that it is going to get credit for softening, which it clearly wants, if it won't actually come out and make that message more explicit.
Molly, I was surprised that Chris Christie used the word pause. I mean, Donald Trump during the primary said the undocumented immigrants in America will be out so fast your head will spin. That is very different than the word pause.
It is. Look, there's been a lot of attempts to muddy the water, but I really think that a decision was made when Trump gave that immigration speech that he cannot walk back. And as Ramesh was saying, the decision was made to cast this issue in very harsh terms, to continue to depict illegal immigrants as criminals and as a danger to this country. And so whatever policy is in the fine print, and I don't think we will ever know that because he's taken all of the positions at once in a way, but the tone of that speech, I think, really closed a door for Trump with some voters who were looking for him to be more compassionate, to strike a tone more of acceptance, no matter what policy he's advocating. I think with certain Hispanic voters and certain non-Hispanic voters, there might have been an open door, and that door was closed by the decision that Trump made to give that speech.
Jamel, who are those voters that Donald Trump's trying to appeal to with this softening, whatever we want to call it, whether it exists or doesn't exist?
I think it's whatever percentage of voters, Republican voters, that are staying away from states like Arizona and Georgia and North Carolina. Like North Carolina, Mitt Romney won that by a slim margin in 2012, and it's pretty much a must-win state for Donald Trump. And I think that margin is mostly the result of Republican voters who are just staying away. And you have all these activated, energized Democratic voters who are sort of taking their place. So as long as Trump is losing that group, which is college-educated, which is suburban, which is predominant in states like Virginia, Colorado, is important in Pennsylvania. As long as Trump is losing that group of voters, then his path to 270 electoral votes is very narrow, if increasingly non-existent.
You know, it's interesting. If you look at most of the demographic groups, they are pretty stable from 4 years ago, and the one exception are college-educated whites.
Right.
In the exit polls in 2012, college-educated whites went Republican by 14 percentage points. And in the last Pew Research Center poll, which is a big respected poll, they went for Hillary Clinton by 14 percentage points. That is the kind of swing that I don't think we've seen before with a big group in American politics since we started polling in the 1950s.
Meaning she's up by 14.
She's up by 14, whereas Barack Obama lost them by 14 points just 4 years ago. Think of what a big swing that is among college-educated whites, a huge part of the U.S. population, a huge part of the electorate in just 4 years. I was talking to political scientists this week's Alan Abramowitz at Emory, who spends a lot of time looking at these questions. We couldn't come up with another example of that kind of swing since 1952, when we started to be able to look at the demographics of presidential elections.
Well, and the gamble of the Trump campaign is that he is realigning the electorate to make up for that swing by attracting more non-college educated white voters and a lot of Democrats. But we haven't seen him do that.
Right.
As you say, all the other groups are stable.
You mentioned Abramowitz. He has a model of election returns that predicts, based on the economy, based on these variables, Trump should win, Clinton should lose. But he doesn't actually think that's going to happen because Trump has run such a different kind of campaign that has scrambled the electorate in that way.
Jamel, do you think, going back to this point that Molly was making about realigning the electorate, If that's your take, then wouldn't you not need to do the softening because you're realigning? In other words, do you see in the softening undermining this notion that there's a huge group of people out there?
I mean, the softening, I think, is de facto evidence that this group of people isn't there, or but it's not large enough to make up for the voters you're losing. I think the original theory was that Trump could have this hardline message and begin to pull non-college educated whites, and specifically non-college educated white men, from Democrats, those who aren't voting, pull them into the electorate. But what's happened is basically, yeah, you have this action, reactivating a bunch of these voters, but you have a reaction too, from college-educated whites, from African Americans, from Latinos, and the reaction is essentially overwhelming the action. And the Trump campaign is now trying to figure out how it can mitigate the reaction, but I just don't think it has time to do so at this point.
Is this, Molly, what you saw in his visit to the Detroit church? This is also a part of this effort, and where do we think that? Is it going to be successful, meaningful? Is it about African Americans, or is it about this group of college-educated voters that we've been talking about?
If there is a political calculation, and I think that's always an if with Trump and his campaign because so much of it is so improvisational and sort of based on the gut. But if there is a calculation, it probably is much more about those white swing voters. On the other hand, you see him getting 0 or 1 or 2% of the African American vote in these polls. There may literally be nowhere to go but up for Donald Trump. And those images where he at least seems to be making contact and listening to African Americans could give him some lift there, but it does seem to be mostly about the predominantly white portion of the electorate that looks at him and believes that he's a racist, that he's intolerant, that he's hateful, and wants to be reassured. These people want to vote for the Republican.
Right.
They want to vote for the person with the R next to his name, and that's why I think Trump still has some upside, but he needs to convince them that they can do that.
And there's some good political science that notes that part of the gender gap in presidential elections is essentially a function of white racial views, that women tend to have softer and less conservative racial views than men do. And when they see candidates who are hardline or seemingly hardline on racial issues, they react very negatively. And so George W. Bush, for example, did better than you would expect among white college-educated women, in part because his brand, as it were, was a Republican with more liberal racial views than your typical Republican.
Ramesh, let me ask you a question about how to fix this brand issue, because you can't do it in one event, and yet when Donald Trump went to meet with the president of Mexico, the word presidential got thrown around a lot. I'm going to apply to the wisdom of the group here. What does it mean to be presidential in a campaign context? What's the real benefit of presidential?
If you look at the breakdown in that North Carolina poll from CBS, a majority of North Carolina voters don't believe that Donald Trump is ready to be commander-in-chief. That is what it means. That is, I think, the central problem of his candidacy. People dislike him, people dislike her, but they think she is ready to be commander-in-chief. They don't believe that he is. That, I think, is when we're talking about presidential, when we're talking about gravitas, changing his image, that's the key thing he has to do.
And can you...
All right. For those of you who don't have their own definition, mine is the projection of power, the projection of persona, the projection of strength. That's what it looks like to be presidential.
Susan, and you've been to many of those kinds of presidential moments, but can you do it in just standing up there and having an image? Is that good enough?
Well, I think that combined with a good performance in debates is probably good enough, because you in fact have an electorate that wants to vote against Hillary Clinton because they don't think she's honest and trustworthy, because they're ready for change after 8 years of a Democratic administration. But Donald Trump, at least so far, has not gotten over the hurdle of looking like you can trust him to be commander-in-chief. That doesn't, I don't think you could say there's no time left for him to do this, because despite all the disadvantages that we've talked about so far for Donald Trump, he's still within striking distance in your national poll, 2 points in your battleground states poll. That, and we've got, 65 days left.
Right. Well, you've given us a segue to talk about Hillary Clinton. Jamel, new information about her FBI interview. The numbers are very soft. In some polls, they're coming down. What is the state of Hillary Clinton's campaign? And, I mean, it's now been several weeks that this comes up. It's a bruise that keeps getting hit.
I pretty much think at this point you can tie Hillary Clinton's fortunes in national polls to the tenor of her news coverage. When news coverage of Clinton is good or neutral, like just after the Democratic conventions, her poll numbers basically hit your 48, your 49% level, and she ends up establishing a 7 or 8 point lead over Trump. When the emails come in, when the foundation comes in, when these questions that remind people of all the things that they do not like about Hillary Clinton, that they do not like about the broader political world come in, her numbers immediately soften to 45, 44. And that's basically been the story going back to even April and May. Her lead after the convention was very similar to her lead right at that time. The difference, well, not the difference, but the same pattern happened in April and May. You had conversations about her emails and the foundation and her speeches and Bernie's attacks, and it softened her to 44, 45. And I think it's almost like a timing game that we'll just see come November where she is in this cycle.
Ramesh, did you take anything away from those FBI reports that is new, or it just sort of the general issue that she has on this that will be with her all the way through to November?
There's always another piece of evidence that tends to reinforce the public's view that there is a lack of transparency, a lack of honesty and forthcomingness from Hillary Clinton. And I don't think that stories about Clinton aides destroying phones with hammers is going to help her in any way. I talked to a Republican about this, a Republican strategist who said, well, at least somebody's keeping this race competitive.
And you had a big potential scandal involving Donald Trump, and I was glad you asked Chris Christie about it, because I'm surprised it hasn't gotten more attention, which is that Donald Trump in 2013, his foundation made an illegal $25,000 contribution to a campaign committee associated with the Florida Attorney General, who was at that time deciding whether to pursue an investigation into Trump University. And this is the kind of thing, he's now paid a fine, which is, as the Washington Post has reported. This should be a major story, and I'm perplexed by why it hasn't gotten more attention. I think one reason is there's so much attention to her scandals, and her credibility to make attacks on the front of honesty and trustworthiness are so low that it's harder for her to generate outrage about this potential scandal involving him.
Well, I guess we know who a Clinton supporter is, but she's right. That Trump scandal got very little coverage. But the thing about Clinton is we just can't trust the bitch. Jesus.
It's a good news cycle for the third-party candidates, I'd say.
Donald Trump has also boasted about being able to do precisely that, give donations to get what he wants. I mean, he hasn't been shy about this. He hasn't spoken directly to that thing, but he has said that's why the system's so corrupt, because I was a master at playing it. Yeah. Molly, let me ask you about on Hillary Clinton. When she speaks, is that good for her campaign or bad, no matter what the topic?
I think it depends. I don't think it is the case that every time she opens her mouth she makes things worse. And I wish she would hold a press conference. I think that whether or not she got herself into further trouble with her answers to questions, it would be refreshing to see her facing the press and answering questions. And she's playing a very conventional campaign strategy where you spend your August fundraising and then you assume that the campaign engages in full after Labor Day. So I think it's safe to assume that we will see more of her doing public events and giving speeches after Labor Day.
Jamel, she's likely to give more policy speeches. Is that a way to beat back the criticism that she's kind of disappeared during August, raised a lot of money while she disappeared? But is that a way out of the fix she faces?
I'm not entirely sure, because I think when it comes to Hillary Clinton's public perception, people kind of just think that she knows a lot, that she's very prepared with regards to policy. The things that people do not like or do not believe about Hillary Clinton, they do not like that she's secretive, they do not believe that she cares about people like them. And I'm not sure if more policy speeches will fix that latter problem. I don't know if she needs to fix the former problem. Bill Clinton never ever really quite fixed the former problem about his trustworthiness, but he was able to convince people that he cared about them. And I think that's Clinton's challenge going forward.
And it may be impossible to fix the first. The cares about you, she could, presumably, if she gave good enough speeches about solutions, that might work. That's it for us. Thank you all very much. We'll be back in a moment. Stay with us.
All right, so that's the Face the Nation roundtable. Oh, and I'm sorry, but the moderator's name is John Dickerson. I forgot to mention that at the beginning of the video.